gateway to East Africa.
The climate emergency is a global emergency. So we need global action. So on one hand, yes, African governments and people have to search for solutions at home. On the other hand, we need global solidarity because a lot of what has caused climate change is coming from outside Africa. So we think it's important to have a global financial architecture that is able to respond to the needs as we have them today, because these are new areas of need. And we don't think that we have that architecture well tuned into supporting and accompanying the recovery of countries, first of all, but also positioning them to adapt to these new realities.
Right. I would like us to delve a bit into the nitty-gritty now. Looking at that statement and the actual reality on the ground, in what ways do you feel these international financial or multilateral financial institutions have become part of the systemic failure in funding, especially when it comes to the funding needs for global and specifically African climate mitigation solutions?
Well, the thing is, financing is key, right? But also the way the finance flows is really important. And we've seen, for instance, in the case of climate finance, that some of the policies and mechanisms that are in place not actually benefiting those who are suffering the most from this. And it's not polluter pays kind of reality right now. And that's what's needed. The rich countries who have the greater share of the emissions should deliver for other countries that are still in a developing state. So where is that facility, financing facility that supports the nationally determined contributions of countries? I mean, some of these African countries have very ambitious contributions, commitments that they've made to net zero. They want to be part of the solution. They are not just playing victim, but they need to be accompanied. And there is no serious financial investment right now. And I would think that the only place to look to if we are making this global action is to look at the existing multilateral institutions that work on finances and really look to them to come up with new models that benefit a positive approach to this. How much will it take? I think it's been costed for Africa at least $100 billion a year, every year, to address in both the adaptation issues but also some of the mitigation issues. Where is that money going to come from? It's not clear, right?
But then when it comes to the long wait that has evidently been seen in terms of the developed countries, holding up or committing to their commitments, living by their commitments, it's taken too long. COP27, there was a high anticipation that it's going to be, and definitely it was Africa's COP, but a lot of people came out of it feeling a bit, shortchanged. But of course, it came up with something that a lot are saying maybe it's a good thing that came out of it, that at least those who are affected will get something for what has been damaged in terms of the climate change, in terms of their contribution. I want to ask you, do you feel that as a continent we've been looking the wrong side, the wrong way? Is it time to look inward to finding solutions in terms of funding, financing?
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. I think, as I said earlier, this is a global challenge, and it needs global action. Mm-hmm. So Africa is not begging for a handout here. It's about climate justice. You take a family in Madagascar that's just been affected by the worst drought that they've ever seen in their lifetime, right? And you also take the fact that evidence that we have now indicates that this is climate induced. That loss, that damage has to be paid by someone. There has to be compensation for it. And for 30 years, activists have worked on getting the world to commit to a loss and damage fund. Finally, that was secured at COP27. That's one set of actions that need to be taken. But of course, we know financing isn't everything.
Correct.
You need to have the whole logistics of how that money flows. And this is where the governance regimes on the continent of Africa now matter. You know, what kind of governance systems and institutions are there? What kind of integrity of these institutions do we have to be able to channel those resources in ways that impact those who have suffered the most? And this is, you know, a responsibility of African, not just governments, African people, civil society, media like yourselves, to make sure that when the money is on the table, it is having an impact where it matters most. It is inclusive. There's some equitable nature to it, and that there is no elite capture of those resources. So there's governance as a part of that, just governance for that matter. But there is also domestic resource mobilization that's important. Africa sometimes forgets that it has a lot of fiscal room in its own revenue generation. We have a lot of illicit financial flows. We need to plug those holes. Almost 100 billion getting out of the continent every year in illicit financial flows. It's time to address that elephant in the room, because that money, if it is secured, could go towards alleviating some of these problems.
Right. And the elephant that we might all want in the room is that one of how do we deal with, or the solutions to dealing with the issues around the inequalities that climate change will bring on the table, or will bring on board. We already know of people who've been displaced, people who've lost their homes, people who've had to move, because of the impact, the devastation of climate change. If we were to look at it from a perspective of support for these people, because it's not going to be easier, because it's getting even worse as we continue. What sort of models would you be seeing that could be able to help in channeling the right kind of support for such people?
Well, I think the first is the recognition that we're in a poly-crisis. It's not just climate change. On top of climate change, countries are still trying to recover from the impact of COVID, which is ongoing. And our assessment is the pace of recovery in Africa. If we continue with that pace, it could take another decade. Many, many millions have been sort of pushed back into poverty. The numbers are over 50 million on the continent right now. That's significant. So when you look at that reversal from COVID, when you look at conflict, the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on cost of living for Africans, whether it's a cost of food, fuel, or fertilizer, it's severe. And then you add to that the impact of climate change on these communities. So we need to first understand that this is comprehensive, right? And therefore, the responses have to be comprehensive. So it's not just about handout. There's short-term measures. Yes, those who are critically affected by food insecurity right now as an emergency need immediate support. And this is where we talk about humanitarian aid, right? For the families in households in the Horn of Africa, in some parts of Southern Africa who are experiencing this. Those who are displaced need special kind of help. But in addition to the immediate support, we don't just give handouts and disappear. We need to accompany the recovery of these populations. And in addition to that, we need to make sure that we're investing in ways that build their resilience. So it's really the humanitarian development nexus. And right now, my concern is that there's a tendency to defund the longer term development investment in favor of the short term. This is not the solution. We need to look at the whole spectrum of support, from emergency to medium to long term.
Right. You said a lot of good things. This is the final question, and one of the things that was very strong that you mentioned in your message during the sessions that we've had at this Africa Economic Conference was that Africa's path to attaining SDGs must be climate smart, and this is actually not an option, but it's an urgent priority. Do you feel those in the room and those outside the four walls of that room who are listening to this, and what should they be doing to actually put this to action as they leave this conference?
Yes, I do feel that people are listening, because people are feeling the heat of this climate change. It's no longer just theory. I think everyone feels that this could actually be them. They could be the victim tomorrow. We don't know. There's so much uncertainty. UNDP published its flagship report this year on the Human Development Report, and it looks at the world of uncertainty. And one of the features of that actually is that most people everywhere in the world today feel less secure than they did in the past. And so it has become commonplace. But are they listening enough in terms of those who actually need to take action? Sometimes one gets frustrated and you feel it's a dialogue with the deaf, because now the evidence is on the table. I mean, it's clear that we're no longer debating that we have a climate emergency. It is clear that it is creating inequality in our world. It is also clear that it's creating insecurity, that we're seeing a regression even in the democratic culture that we fought hard for. And it's clear that some communities may disappear in a few years, who are so vulnerable because they're in small island developing states. But the urgency that is required to address these stark challenges, we're not seeing that. But we don't give up, because I think we need to keep pressing until it is done.
Your gateway to East Africa.